not expand 1 inch to the east, which would at least give Russia some breathing room. Now, Gorbachev also proposed a nuclear weapons-free zone from the Arctic to the Mediterranean, which would have, again, given some protection and, in fact, security for peace. Well, that was just rejected. I don't even think it was answered. Well, that's where things stood in 1989, 90. Then Bill Clinton was elected. One of his first acts was to break the promise and expand NATO to the east, which, of course, is a threat to Russian security. Now, the pretext given, for example, by his Strobe Talbot, who was the Undersecretary of State for Eastern Europe, is that was necessary to bring the former satellites into the European Union. But that can't be. There are states inside the European Union that are not part of NATO. Austria, Finland, Sweden, so that's irrelevant. But it was a threat, and Russia, of course, reacted to the hostile threat. It increased tension. Well, going up to the present, President Obama's National Security Advisor, James Jones, has been a strong advocate of the view that NATO should expand further to the east and to the south, and that, in fact, it should, to the east and to the south means to control the energy-producing regions. The head of NATO, Dutch Secretary of General De Hoop Scheffer, has proposed, advocates that NATO should take the responsibility for protecting energy supplies to the West, pipelines, sea lanes, and so on. Well, now we're getting to Afghanistan, which is right in the, has always been of great geostrategic importance because of its location. Now more than ever because of its location relative to the energy-producing regions in the Gulf region and in Central Asia. So yes, that's what we're seeing. Actually, there's more to say about NATO, about why it exists. So we might look back, say, 10 years to the 50th anniversary. Well, the 50th anniversary of NATO was a gloomy affair. There was, right at that time, NATO was bombing Serbia illegally, as everyone admitted, claiming it was necessary for humanitarian reasons. That was at the NATO summit, there was much agonizing about how we cannot tolerate atrocities so near Europe. Well, that was an interesting comment, since at that time, NATO was supporting atrocities right inside NATO. Turkey, for example, was carrying out, with massive U.S. aid, huge atrocities against its Kurdish population, far worse than anything reported in Kosovo. Right at that time in East Timor, you're not going to praise yourself, so if you don't mind, I will. At the time of the Dili massacre, which you and Alan heroically exposed, atrocities continued. And in fact, in early 1999, they were picking up again with strong U.S. support. Again, far beyond anything reported in Kosovo. That's the U.S. and Britain, the core of NATO, right at the same time. In fact, Dennis Blair, President Obama, inside President Obama's national security circle, he was sent to Indonesia, theoretically, to try to get the Indonesian army to stop carrying out the mounting atrocities. But he supported them. He met with the top Indonesian general, General Wiranto, and essentially said, go ahead. And they did. And in fact, those atrocities could have been stopped at any moment. That was demonstrated in September 1999, when Bill Clinton, under very extensive domestic and international pressure, finally decided to call it off. He didn't have to bomb Jakarta. He didn't have to impose an embargo. He just told the Indonesian generals the game's over, and they immediately withdrew. That goes down in history as a great humanitarian intervention. That's not exactly the right story. Right up until then, the United States was continuing to support the atrocities. Britain under its new ethical foreign policy, didn't quite get in on time, and they kept supporting them even after the Australian-led UN peacekeeping force entered. Well, that's NATO 10 years ago. It's even putting aside the claims about Serbia, which maybe a word about those are worthwhile. We know what happened in Serbia. There's a massive, in Kosovo, there's massive documentation from the State Department, from NATO, European Union observers on the ground. There was a level of atrocities sort of distributed between the guerrillas and the Serbs, but it was expected that the NATO bombing would radically increase the atrocities, which it did. If you look back at the Milosevic indictment in the middle of the bombing, almost entirely about atrocities, except for one exception, about atrocities after the NATO bombing. That's what they anticipated. General Clark the commanding general, had informed Washington weeks earlier, yes, that would be the consequence. He informed the press of that as the bombing started. That was the humanitarian intervention, while NATO was supporting even worse atrocities, right within NATO, in East Timor, and go on in other cases. Well, that's NATO 10 years ago. And it begins to tell us what NATO is for. Is it for defending Europe from attack? In fact, there is such a pretense now. So when President Bush started installing missile defense systems in Eastern Europe, the claim was, well, this is to defend Europe from attack against Iranian nuclear-tipped missiles. In fact, that doesn't have any, doesn't matter. And the fact that if it had any, it would be total insanity for them to even arm one, because the country would be vaporized in 30 seconds. And it's a threat to Russia again, just like Clinton's expansion of NATO to the east.
France joining?
Pardon?
France joining now, rejoining?
France joining is quite interesting. I mean, France had a policy initiated by General de Gaulle of trying to turn Europe into what was then called a third force, independent of the two superpowers. So Europe should pursue an independent course. It was, he spoke of Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals. That was a great fear of the United States since the Second World War, that Europe would strike out on its own after reconstructing, which it could. The economies on the scale of the United States, no reason, except in military force, it's comparable to the United States. So it could have been a move towards a peaceful Europe, independent of the superpowers. In fact, a large part of the purpose of NATO was to prevent that from happening, to ensure that Europe would stay within the U.S. umbrella, under U.S. control. Well, France has now abandoned that position and has rejoined what is now just an intervention force, an international intervention force, exactly as James Jones and Hoopcheffer and others portray it. It's an international intervention force under U.S. command. Why should it exist? In fact, if you go back to 1989 and 1990, it's extremely interesting to see how the United States reacted to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So right after the fall of the Berlin Wall, which 20 years ago, which signaled the end of the Soviet Union clearly, the Bush administration, Bush 1, immediately released a national security strategy, a military budget, and so on, which are very interesting reading. What they say, in effect, is everything's going to go on exactly as before, but with new pretexts. So now we have to have a huge military establishment and military budget, and not to protect ourselves from the Russians who are collapsing, but because, literally, because of the technological sophistication of third world powers. Now that was promulgated without ridicule. You know, if someone was watching from Mars, they'd collapse in laughter. So because of the technological sophistication of third world powers, we have to keep this huge military budget. We have to keep intervention forces aimed at the Middle East, the main target of intervention. Why? Not because of the Russians. It said, as had been claimed, what it said was we have to direct the intervention forces to the Middle East, where our problems could not be laid at the Kremlin's door. So in other words, we've been lying to you for 50 years, but now the clouds have lifted, so we just have to have intervention forces aimed at the Middle East, because we have to control it. we have to maintain what they call the defense industrial base. That's a euphemism for high technology industry. That's why you have things like